The rain started somewhere over Oregon. Inside the cabin of a Boeing 727, a man in a dark suit and sunglasses sat quietly with a briefcase on his lap. He had ordered a bourbon and soda. He had paid for it. Outside the window, the sky was the color of wet slate, and below, the forests of the Pacific Northwest rolled out in an unbroken carpet of green, cut by rivers no one could name from that height. At some point after 8 o'clock in the evening, on November 24th, 1971, that man lowered the plane's rear staircase into the freezing night air, stepped out into the darkness above the Cascade Mountains, and was never seen again. He had $200,000 in ransom money strapped to his body. He had a parachute. And he had a name that wasn't really his name at all. The FBI would spend 45 years chasing him. They would question suspects, dig through swampland, analyze scraps of a parachute, and study 9,800 individual dollar bills. And in the end, they would close the most extensive case in the Bureau's history without ever learning who he was. This is the story of D.B. Cooper. To understand how a man could vanish into thin air, quite literally, you have to understand what commercial air travel looked like in America at the start of the 1970s. It was, by today's standards, remarkably unguarded. There was no widespread passenger screening, no metal detectors at most gates. You could buy a ticket with cash, use a fake name, and walk straight onto a plane. Between 1968 and 1972, the United States saw a wave of airline hijackings, so common that some crews carried extra cash on board specifically to pay off hijackers and end the situation quickly. It was, quite simply, a golden age for skyjacking. And on the day before Thanksgiving in 1971, one man was about to make it infamous. At Portland International Airport, a passenger approached the counter of Northwest Orient Airlines and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington. He paid $20 in cash. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. He was described by staff and fellow passengers as a man in his mid-40s, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, wearing a black raincoat, a dark suit, a white shirt, and a black tie. He carried a briefcase and boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 without incident. The flight was short, barely 30 minutes in the air, one of the most ordinary commuter hops in the Pacific Northwest. Nothing about the man suggested anything unusual. He sat in seat 18C near the rear of the plane, lit a cigarette, and ordered a drink. Then he handed flight attendant Florence Schaffner a note. She assumed it was a phone number, the kind of thing a lonely businessman might slip a stewardess on a dull evening flight. She put it in her pocket without reading it. Cooper leaned over and quietly told her she'd better look at it. He had a bomb in his briefcase. Schaffner read the note, and Cooper calmly opened his briefcase just enough for her to see a tangle of wires and red cylinders. Whether it was a real explosive device has never been confirmed, but it looked convincing enough, and Schaffner had no reason to gamble on the alternative. Cooper's demands were specific, and by the standards of the era, almost businesslike. He wanted $200,000 in cash, unmarked $20 bills. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve. And when the plane landed, he wanted it refueled and ready to fly onward, with all passengers released unharmed. Northwest Orient's president authorized the payment personally. The airline wanted this handled quietly, and it wanted its passengers safe. While the plane circled Seattle for nearly 2 hours, waiting for the money and parachutes to be gathered, the passengers were told only that there was a minor mechanical delay. Most had no idea they were part of a hijacking until it was over. When the plane finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, Cooper allowed the 36 passengers and 2 flight attendants to leave. He kept the cockpit crew, refueled the aircraft, and reviewed the parachutes that had been delivered, apparently inspecting them closely enough to reject one as unsuitable. Then he gave his final instructions. The plane would take off again, heading toward Mexico City, flying low, under 10,000 feet, with the wing flaps set at a specific angle, the landing gear down, and the cabin unpressurized. It was an unusual flight configuration, one that suggested this was a man who understood aviation. Somewhere over the dense, roadless wilderness of southwest Washington, in the pouring rain and near total darkness, Cooper lowered the aft staircase of the 727, a rare feature of that aircraft model, and stepped out into the night. The crew, still in the cockpit, felt the pressure change. They did not see him jump. No one did. When the plane landed at Reno, Nevada, Cooper was gone. So was the money. So, in every meaningful sense, was the man who called himself Dan Cooper. A journalist covering the story would introduce an error that became legend. He referred to the hijacker as D.B. Cooper instead of Dan Cooper, likely confusing him with a different person questioned early in the investigation. The mistake stuck, and it stuck permanently. The country would come to know him by an initial that wasn't even accurate. The FBI's investigation, which they designated NORJAK for Northwest Hijacking, became one of the longest continuously running cases in the Bureau's history. Agents interviewed everyone connected to the flight. They pulled fingerprints from the plane, from the note, from the drink glass Cooper left behind. They compiled a list of over 800 suspects. And they searched. Ground teams and aircraft combed the forests of southwest Washington for weeks. The terrain Cooper had jumped into was some of the most unforgiving in the country. Thick timber, steep ravines, freezing temperatures, and heavy rain. He had jumped at night, in a business suit and loafers, with no established skydiving experience, into conditions that experienced parachutists considered extremely dangerous. For years, nothing surfaced. Then, in February of 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington, when he found several decaying packets of cash. FBI analysis confirmed the serial numbers matched bills from the ransom money. It was the only piece of the $200,000 ever recovered, roughly $5,800 in decomposing 20s. The discovery reignited the case and deepened the puzzle. If Cooper had died in the jump, or shortly after landing, how had the money traveled roughly 20 miles from the presumed jump zone to that particular sandbar? Geologists and hydrologists have since studied the river's dredging and flow patterns, and the leading theory suggests the money could have been carried there through natural sediment movement or dredging operations tied to the river, rather than by Cooper himself. But it remains just that, a theory. Over the decades, the FBI investigated numerous suspects. Richard McCoy Jr., a Vietnam veteran and trained parachutist, hijacked a similar flight less than 5 months after Cooper and used a strikingly similar method. But he was eventually ruled out through physical description and other evidence. Kenneth Christiansen, a former paratrooper and Northwest Orient employee, drew suspicion after his death, when relatives noted similarities in age and appearance, but there was no direct evidence tying him to the crime. Dwayne Weber, on his deathbed, told his wife he was Dan Cooper, but investigators found no conclusive forensic link. Robert Rackstraw, a Vietnam veteran with a checkered legal history, was investigated and publicly named by independent researchers, but the FBI stated the evidence did not support charging him. None of these leads produced a conviction. None produced a confirmed identity.
In July of 2016,
the FBI formally announced it was suspending active investigation into the case, citing limited resources and the absence of new evidence, though evidence submitted by the public would still be reviewed. After 45 years, the Bureau closed its most exhaustive unsolved hijacking case without a name, a body, or a confirmed conclusion. The physical evidence that remains is sparse, but tantalizing. The ransom note, the black clip-on tie Cooper left behind in his seat, which decades later yielded traces of rare earth elements, sometimes associated with metallurgical or electronics manufacturing, hinting, though not proving, that Cooper may have worked in an industrial or technical field. The recovered cash, and the parachute Cooper didn't use, which some skydivers have suggested indicates he had specific knowledge of parachute types, since he left behind an older military-style chute in favor of another. The theories about what happened to him fall broadly into three camps. The first is that Cooper did not survive the jump. Skydiving experts have long argued that jumping at night, in poor weather, into mountainous forest, wearing street clothes and dress shoes, with a parachute he may not have been fully trained on, made survival unlikely. Under this theory, his body and the bulk of the money simply were never found, consistent with the vast, remote terrain he jumped into. The second is that Cooper survived the jump, but died or disappeared in the wilderness shortly afterward, perhaps from exposure or injury, with his remains never recovered in terrain that has swallowed searchers and hunters before him. The third, the one that fuels the enduring fascination, is that Cooper survived entirely, that he made it out of the forest, disappeared into ordinary American life, and lived out his years as someone else, telling no one, or perhaps telling only one person, decades later, in a quiet confession that could never be verified. Each theory fits some of the facts. None fits all of them. What remains unknown is almost everything that matters. His real name, his background, whether he had any genuine parachuting experience or was simply lucky and reckless in equal measure. Why he chose that particular flight, that particular route, that particular moment in aviation history when hijacking was almost disturbingly easy to attempt. And what happened to him in the black, freezing airspace above the Cascades in the seconds after he stepped out into the rain, and the case file simply says, "Subject not seen again." The FBI's case is closed. The forest has kept its silence for over 50 years. And somewhere in the story of D.B. Cooper is a truth that may never surface again, buried perhaps in the same wilderness that swallowed him. If you found this story as compelling as we did, consider subscribing to The True Unknown. We bring you real mysteries backed by real evidence and let you decide what you believe.